on behalf of the Moshe Dayan Center and to give a lecture about my visit to Azaz in northern Syria in December of 2014. I was there for 4 days between 18th and 22nd of December, and as has been mentioned, I stayed with the local rebel group that controls the town of Azaz, Sunni Arab rebel group known as the Northern Storm Brigade. But just to preface, so people get some kind of just so that people can get some geographical orientation of where I was and the wider area. So to get to Azaz, firstly, I'd flown to Istanbul airport, not on this map. But then I went to a southern town called Gaziantep, which is to the northeast of this town called Kilis, which is inside of Turkey. So I was in Gaziantep, and I met my contact from Northern Storm, who is the official spokesman for the group, a man called Abdul Qadir Abu Yusuf, about whom a bit more later. And we went together to Kilis by bus, and then I crossed the Bab al-Salama border crossing and with him, and I came to the Azaz area. So Azaz really is quite strategically, it's been quite an important point, because whoever controls Azaz really, it should give access to a vital border crossing, which of course is important for the inflow of goods into rebel-held areas to distribute to local populations and so on. Crossing the Bab al-Salama border crossing, I did so officially, so I actually had to go through the Turkish border authorities to get approval to go in. Of course, though, actually, to this day, there still remains quite a negligent policy on the part of the Turkish border authorities. The questioning is quite minimal. I was asked, what my purpose was, and you can explain it in a sentence just to do journalistic work. It was no real further problem. The only thing they wanted to be sure of was I'd had my Turkish e-visa that meant that my visit to Turkey was legal in the first place. But the fact I did cross, and I used a UK passport, my UK passport to do so, does actually contradict some of the media reports, many of which, because so few journalists now go inside Syria, it's easy to get the facts wrong. But I recall a recent report in Sky News, for example, that said that only Syrian citizens could cross the Bab al-Salama border crossing. But on the basis of my own experience, that's plainly not true. Incidentally, at the current time, the Bab al-Salama border crossing is closed until further notice. This happens from time to time. I'm sure it will be reopened in the near future. So now going inside of Syrian territory, we've crossed in. So this is the town I stayed in, Azaz. As I mentioned, it is controlled by a rebel group known as Northern Storm. Going out then towards the east of Azaz, so talking now about the current situation, you go east, you come to these areas like Akhtarin and Darbik and Al-Ra'i. This is all Islamic State territory now, and this is a front line that has remained static for around 7 months, going back to August of 2014, so this is around 7 months or so. And what had happened was that IS had made some further advances from the east, so all these towns which were actually previously controlled by other rebel groups became part of IS territory. But otherwise, the front line remains static. So Northern Storm also is in a little village here called Soran, and you go beyond a bit beyond Soran, and this is a front line of a no man's land of about 800 meters to a kilometer, and then beyond that is IS territory. So this is actually one of the places I went to as well during my time there. Just to talk about some of these other towns in the wider area, Tel Rafat and Maria, which are particularly highlighted here. Tel Rafat is controlled by a different rebel group called Liwa al-Fateh, but is part of the same wider rebel coalition as Northern Storm. Maria is controlled by Liwa Tawhid, very familiar brand in the rebel brand in the Aleppo province. Again, though, these are all now part of the wider rebel coalition, which in Aleppo province, which is called the Levant Front or the Shami Front, which is a merger of 5 different rebel coalitions. Then, just to go to the west of Azaz, you see this Efrin. This is Kurdish territory, and I didn't go there during my visit. This is controlled by the so-called Democratic Union Party, or also PYD for short, and its military wing, the YPG, or People's Protection Units. Just going a bit further south, to give some more context again, Nubal is a notable Shia village which is still controlled by the regime and is being besieged by the rebels, and one of the regime's current goals is to try to break the siege, break the siege of Nubal, and also a nearby village which is also Shia called Zahra. Then you see a town here called Horaitan. This is another notable rebel-held locality. Has a much stronger influence of Syria's al-Qaeda affiliate, Jabhat al-Nusra, which is in actually towns like Azaz and Tel Rafat and Maria, but the numbers of Nusra members in these towns, like Azaz, Tel Rafat and Maria, it only goes into the dozens. And there is some influence, but it's not governing authority influence. Now, in contrast, in Horaitan, there is a Jabhat al-Nusra legal body called the Dar al-Qadha, which issues rulings. For example, in December they put out a statement ordering the closure of billiards, computer game and table football shops on the grounds that they're not legitimate according to Sharia. So the point is, this is more stronger Nusra territory than the likes of these towns. And then, of course, there's familiar Aleppo city. And just north of that is a place called Handaraj, which is still the site of ongoing clashes between Assad regime forces and the rebels. And on that front, the rebels, a variety of different brands are coordinating, including Jabhat al-Nusra and Northern Storm. That just to give some context as to this wider area that I was in, and now to move on specifically to the history of Azaz, which I think, and people may ask why is that relevant, I think Azaz embodies many of the wider trends that have marked the Syrian civil war since its outbreak in 2011. This is just a photo from Azaz outside the house of the former leader of Northern Storm, who's currently a senior advisor for the group. As you can see, it's really not a well-maintained infrastructure by any means. I mean, sure, it was neglected during the regime, during the era of regime control, but I mean, it's not as if the rebels have resources really to undertake large-scale repair of whatever further damage there might have been from clashes and airstrikes. Okay, so going on to the history of Azaz, Azaz, I think, really embodies the conservative Sunni Arab rural countryside that really defines the backbone of the Syrian rebellion. Once protests started breaking out in some of the major cities, it doesn't take long, I think, before the countryside aspect of the revolt comes out. And so in 2011, a local rebel brand is founded in Azaz by the name of Northern Storm, or the Northern Storm Brigade, Liwa Asfat al-Shimal, by a local businessman called Ammar Dadikhi. And it developed out of a generic kind of rebel brand known as Ahrar al-Shimal, so the Free Men of the North. And so in this context, Northern Storm emerges as a local independent brand. Yes, they call themselves the FSA, or al-Jaysh al-Suri al-Hur, or al-Jaysh al-Hur. But just for from my own experiences, I think it's best not to get too caught up with that label as a category, because Jaysh al-Hur is so widely used, even after Northern Storm has switched its alliances over the years, that I think it's a rather meaningless term. And what we just have to know is that when Northern Storm was founded, it was a local independent brand, and it drew from the locality of Azaz, and it was the main brand right up till the expulsion of the regime presence in Azaz in a local battle that occurred in July of 2012. When I was touring through Azaz, I saw some of the remains of buildings that had been destroyed during the clashes. They still haven't been repaired to this day. But Northern Storm was the rebel force behind that expulsion of the regime presence in July of 2012. And following on from that is the siege of a regime airbase known as Menag Air Base. And Northern Storm joined that siege in a bid to build its clout as a local power. And of course, being the main brand in Azaz, and having no effective rivals, they also had virtual control over the Bab es-Salama border crossing that I'd mentioned earlier. So Northern Storm is in quite a lucrative position in 2012. I'd really say that 2012, early 2013 is really Northern Storm's heyday as a rebel brand. Then a break-off occurs involving another local man from the area called Ahmed Obeid. He didn't really like. He felt that Ahmad Dadichi wasn't Islamic enough. What had happened after the overthrow of the regime presence? A local council was established, and this is a local council was established, and this is a crucial body to bear in mind when we come later to discussion of current administration in Azaz. But Ahmed Obeid felt that Northern Storm wasn't Islamic enough, and so he formed a break-off rebel group known as the Liwa Amru ibn al-As, named after the Muslim conqueror of Egypt during the early Arab conquests after the death of Prophet Muhammad. He established a training camp to the north of Azaz town, and to help him in his efforts, another key figure who in this narrative arrived in Azaz, in the Azaz area, because Azaz is a district, not just a town. But a man arrived in the Azaz district in 2012 known as Abu Ubaid al-Masri. We still don't know his real name, but he was an Egyptian man, and he decided to team up with Ahmed Obeid, and the two of them form a brand called Jaish Muhammad. Full name actually was Jaish Muhammad fi Bilad al-Sham, which means the army of Muhammad in Bilad al-Sham, Bilad al-Sham being another name for Syria or Greater Syria, depending on how you see it. And Abu Ubaid al-Masri's main function, his usefulness to Ahmed Obeid, was he could use his influence to bring in foreign fighters from elsewhere in the Muslim world, such as, for example, Libyans. And it's rumored that some of these people would then actually eventually go on to join what became ISIS, or the Islamic State in Iraq and Isham, but a bit more on that later. So Jaish Muhammad is the main rival now to Northern Storm, but despite this establishment and the growth in numbers, which is also facilitated by a couple of Iraqis who were living in northern Aleppo province as refugees, a guy called Abu Suhaib al-Iraqi in particular. He also helped to use his influence to bring in foreign fighters. Northern Storm remains the effective governing authority in Azaz, and then in 2012, at the end of 2012, this is around November-December time, a break-off occurs in which Abu Ubaid al-Masri breaks from Ahmed Obeid, and each of them now leads their own Jaish Muhammad fi Bilad al-Sham, although Ahmed Obeid continues to use this brand name as well, implying his following to be bigger than it actually is. At one point in 2013, he said, "I'm the leader of Jaish Muhammad, which includes Liwa Amru ibn al-As." So the fitna occurs, Arabic word meaning strife, but the one who remains in Azaz, and specifically inside Azaz town, is Abu Ubaid al-Masri's contingent. Ahmed Obeid leaves the Azaz area, spreads himself around Aleppo province, and really from this point we can consider him not really a significant player in subsequent events. These are just some of the various logos by which you can recognize this is Liwat Shamal, this is Northern Storm in Azaz. This is Ahmed Obeid's initial formation. It emerged in a video in August 2012. Liwa Amru ibn al-As, but it's still using these familiar colors and symbols that you would probably recognize as so-called FSA symbols, or Free Syrian Army. So that really reflects the perceived atmosphere of the wider revolt as this broadly nationalistic revolt. And then this is after the break-off occurs that Ahmed, again, each man is using Jaish Mohammed as his own brand name, and so this says the media office for Jaish Mohammed in Bilad al-Sham, Liwa Amru ibn al-Asan is Yuqaddim presents. So this is from a video, but you see the new logo here, and it's a move away from this nationalist imagery and one more based around Islam. Jaish Mohammed, Liwa Amru ibn al-Asan, there's a Quran there. This is the Shahada, the no deity but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. And this is the brand that Abu Ubaid al-Masri adopts for his Jaish Mohammed. And as you can see, with the entire world there depicted, including Australia, North America, and so on, reflects more the overt global jihadist orientation of Abu Ubaid al-Masri and his formation. It's much more within the line of global jihad, and it's been claimed that actually his allegiance all along has been to Al-Qaeda Central. And he also, just to make clear, this says Abu Ubaid al-Muhajir. This is al-Muhajir means the immigrant the one who's come into Syria, more or less. And he is. This is just it's synonymous with Abu Ubaid al-Masri. That it's the same person. And it's the slogan here, "Nantasiru aw namut," meaning either we are victorious or we die. Now going into 2013, the rebel siege of Manag Air Base, as I'd mentioned earlier, is ongoing. It doesn't have much success, and Ahmad Adihi dies from wounds he sustains during the siege in January of 2013, and he's replaced by another local from Azaz called Samir Amouri, another local businessman, and who's currently, as I'd mentioned, a senior advisor to the group. I stayed with him for a night in his house in Azaz. So I would still say that this is still the heyday of Northern Storm, and they still have this important influence over the Bab al-Salama border crossing. At the same time, you're starting to see more recognizable rebel brands at this point, going beyond nationalist orientation and more explicitly Islamist, like, say, the Liwat Tawheed, and these big rebel coalitions like the Syrian Islamic Liberation Front and the Syrian Islamic Front, and so these other brand names you will have probably heard of, like Ahrar Sham. These names start to emerge on the scene, but in Azaz it's still very much Northern Storm. Northern Storm is dominant despite the presence of Abu Ubaid al-Masri's Jaish Mohammed. And in March 2013, Abu Ubaid al-Masri joins a rebel coalition, a foreign fighter coalition or jihadist coalition called Jaish al-Muhajirin wal-Ansar, which means the Emigrants and Helpers Army, which is led by someone you will have probably heard of by now, Abu Omar al-Shishani, who first emerged in Syria in 2012, leading something called Katib al-Muhajirin. But in March 2013, Omar al-Shishani, he announces this new formation, the Jaish al-Muhajirin wal-Ansar, which at least officially in the announcement video included Abu Ubaid al-Masri. However, it didn't last long, because this is March 2013. April 2013 comes the announcement of ISIS by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. He claims that Jabhat al-Nusra, or Syria's, what is now known as Syria's al-Qaeda affiliate, he claimed Jabhat al-Nusra was a mere extension of his Islamic State of Iraq, and therefore should be subsumed under his authority to become ISIS, or the Islamic State, in Iraq and Asham. Rejected by Jabhat al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda orders Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi to retreat, but he does not do so, and so ISIS becomes established on the Syrian scene. This is after April. This is April 2013 onwards, and in May 2013, Abu Omar Shishani gives allegiance to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and he's made the northern governor, so to speak, of Syrian territories. And we know that Masri, after that point, didn't remain within Omar Shishani's coalition, because he's never given his allegiance to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. So from this point, after May 2013, it's Jaysh al-Muhajirin wal-Ansar. It's affiliated with ISIS, and their part now, they're also joining in on the rebel siege of Manag Air Base. And ISIS begins expanding across northern Syria. The origin of their presence in many places in Aleppo province, in northern Aleppo province, is the fact that local Jabhat al-Nusra affiliates accept Baghdadi's argument that Jabhat al-Nusra is supposedly a mere extension of the Islamic State of Iraq, and so they pledge allegiance to ISIS. But that wasn't the case in Azaz. In the case of Azaz, what it was, an ISIS contingent came from outside in July, this is July 2013. They enter into Azaz. There were some local protests at the time against ISIS, although ISIS did hold a counter rally. But what ISIS does in July 2013 upon entering the town of Azaz is they establish a dawah office. Dawah meaning Arabic term for religious outreach and propagation to the local population. They establish a dawah office in a building in Azaz, and the idea, what they're aiming to do is they're aiming to recruit people in Azaz who don't like Northern Storm. And this is actually something admitted by Samir Amouri, the former leader of Northern Storm, and who was leading Northern Storm at that time, about the fact that they were drawing in people in Azaz who didn't like Northern Storm. Jaysh Muhammad, just to remind you of Abu Ubaid al-Masri, is still inside Azaz. They're also expanding their presence elsewhere in Azaz. But the point is, they're not full-blown enemies at the time. ISIS and Northern Storm, they're not full-blown enemies at this time. They are they're working together, for example, on the siege of Manag Air Base. And the following month, in August 2013, Manag Air Base falls out of regime control. It's taken over by the rebels, in part thanks to ISIS-directed suicide bomb attacks that meant that ISIS led the takeover of Manag Air Base and seized the bulk of the weaponry there. But they're still not full-blown. They're still not enemies of Northern Storm at this point. And so, in this context, which had been mentioned by Ronan in the introduction about this, Stephen Sotlov entered the Azaz area in August of 2013, and the allegation is that Northern Storm sold him out to ISIS. My own view of that is that is probably the case. I don't have definite proof for it. I don't think anyone ever could, because if you tried asking Northern Storm about it, they will, of course, deny it. And I'm not going to try to get a gotcha moment where I get one of them to secretly admit to it. However, Samir Amouri did mention to me, which does strengthen the case that Stephen Sotlov was sold out. He mentioned in August that at that time, August 2013, when Manag Air Base fell, he used to be friends with the local ISIS leader in the Azaz area, a man called Abdul Rahman al-Kuwaiti, who, as his name suggests, is originally from Kuwait. And that Abdul Rahman al-Kuwaiti used to come to the Bab al-Salam, a border crossing. They would chat, pray together. They were good. They were friends, essentially. So it makes perfect sense in that context that that Northern Storm might want to sell out Stephen Sotlov as a goodwill gesture to ISIS. To say, we're on your, when we don't mean you any ill will. We're not trying to bring in spies and so in that context, I do think it's plausible that Stephen Sotlov was sold out by Northern Storm to ISIS. But then, of course, a conflict develops with ISIS, between Northern Storm and ISIS. In September of 2013, Northern Storm begins to claim that ISIS begins to claim that a German doctor, someone of German nationality, but Syrian in origin, is working in one of the private hospitals in Azaz. Claims that ISIS claims that this guy is a spy, allegedly because he'd been taking photographs of ISIS positions in Azaz town. Northern Storm denies it, of course, but ISIS uses that pretext to attack Northern Storm and begin besieging their positions in Azaz. And as I'd mentioned, they seized the bulk of the weaponry from Menag Air Base, and they will undoubtedly have used a good deal of it to begin attacking, to attack Northern Storm positions. I hope that wasn't too much of a distraction from what I've been saying. But so as I mentioned, September 2013 is where the change comes. As I mentioned, ISIS claimed that this German doctor is of German nationality but of Syrian origin, and he's working in one of the private hospitals in Azaz. They say he's a spy because he's been allegedly been taking photos of ISIS positions in the town. Northern Storm denies it and wants to protect him. That causes the outbreak of the initial conflict, in which ISIS begins attacking Northern Storm positions and will have used weaponry from Menag Air Base that they'd seized to attack Northern Storm positions. But at that point, rebels from outside intervene, specifically Liwat Tawhid, which is one of the most powerful Aleppo rebel groups, and brokers a ceasefire. It's meant to enforce it, but then that very quickly falls apart as ISIS then uses the opportunity to attack Northern Storm positions again. And this time around, the rebels don't intervene to stop it. So Northern Storm, by October 2013, is expelled from Azaz. And you might ask, well, why didn't they intervene? Variety of reasons why they didn't intervene to stop ISIS from taking over. Liwat Tawhid had problems with Northern Storm over the issue of Northern Storm taking some Lebanese citizens who had allegedly been pilgrims. Northern Storm officially claimed that they were Iranian agents or Hezbollah agents or something along those lines. But Liwat Tawhid had a problem with it, and I think it had come to define some of the tension, and in that context, Liwat Tawhid might have felt that Northern Storm weren't worth saving. And given the prior reputation of having been seen as a group that sells out people for money, and and with its influence over the Bab es-Salama border crossing, Northern Storm is perceived by many rebels as a criminal group, and there's no point in trying to save them against ISIS. Also, again, I said there's multiple reasons for this, but I also think some of the rebels felt that they weren't strong enough to take on ISIS. They felt that if they opened up a new front against ISIS, it would mean a two-front war, and the rebels simply felt that they weren't strong enough to do that. So a multitude of reasons for not intervening. I think it was a mistake, and I think that the rebels did make miscalculations in trying to broker compromises with ISIS rather than recognizing the problem with ISIS, which is, of course, that it perceives itself as an actual state, and so ultimately it's not amenable to power sharing. So Azaz becomes an ISIS stronghold. Now, incidentally, Abu Ubaid al-Masri's Jaish Mohammed still remains in Azaz while ISIS controls the town. And Jaish Mohammed are perfectly happy with this, and because Jaish Mohammed is a jihadist group. They don't like Northern Storm. They think that Northern Storm doesn't implement Islamic law strictly enough. So, as far as they're concerned, ISIS are their ideological compatriots, and they should be supported in expelling. They should be supported in expelling Northern Storm from Azaz. And so they still remain in the town, and they're happy with this so-called Emirate of Azaz, which ISIS establishes. Now, the Emirate of Azaz, Imarat to Azaz, Emirate is an important concept for understanding the evolution of ISIS governing structure. As we know, ISIS now calls itself the Caliphate that claims authority over all the world's Muslims and is ultimately seeking to dominate the whole world. The emirate idea is important because it shows in what direction ISIS were going. Because emirate is a predecessor to a caliphate. And which is what, for example, in contrast, Jabhat al-Nusra, or Syria's al-Qaeda affiliate, is aiming to establish in Syria, an Islamic emirate. The Islamic emirate is the stepping stone to the caliphate. Just ISIS were doing it at a much quicker pace and wants to lead the whole initiative themselves. And so a billboard was actually put up. I haven't put it in this presentation, but ISIS put up a billboard in the Azaz area after they took it over from Northern Storm with a new slogan, Mashru' al-Khilaf al-Maw'ud, or the promised project of the caliphate, which really shows the direction in which ISIS were going. I mean, people say that ISIS were part of al-Qaeda until they were disowned in February 2014. What I would argue is actually the real break-off came when Baghdadi refused to disband ISIS, and this pushing in the direction of a caliphate with setting up so-called emirates and introducing slogans of the referring to the caliphate shows that direction as is an important case to bear in mind. Just some key figures and points of important figures from the Emirate of Azaz. Abdul Rahman al-Kuwaiti, as I mentioned, he was the local leader in the Azaz area when ISIS first entered Azaz in July 2013. He was the appointed emir or ruler of Azaz, but he had to leave his position after a month for unspecified reasons relating to poor conduct. And eventually he's more or less disappeared from the record. He turned up in a photo in Anbar province in Iraq in early 2014, but otherwise, after a month or so after the ISIS takeover, he's not important. And so he's replaced by a man known as Abu Aisha al-Jazrawi. And as the al-Jazrawi moniker suggests, this guy is from Saudi Arabia originally. And he's the emir of Azaz until he's killed in infighting that breaks out with rebels in January of 2014. He's killed fighting elsewhere in northern Aleppo province. Another important guy is a 16-year-old called Murad Halak, who is a local from Azaz. He is appointed head of intelligence by ISIS, or security emir, in Azaz, and his responsibility is to track down remnants of Northern Storm and inform on their presence to ISIS so they can be rounded up and arrested. So this is after the routing of Northern Storm. Nowadays he's said to still be alive now, but nowadays he's just an ordinary foot soldier for ISIS, and he left the Azaz area after ISIS withdrew some months later. And also the administration in Azaz is much, much simpler than the structures that have emerged within the Islamic State's territory. A very familiar marking of proto-governance is the Islamic court that ISIS would set up in areas where it established a presence, whether or not it actually solely controlled the town. The Islamic court, or the Virtue and Vice Committee. They also set up a committee to address complaints. If locals had a problem with conduct of ISIS members, then they should bring it to this committee, and in theory it should be addressed. And it's not something entirely divorced from reality. The fact that ISIS, on a more general level, the fact that ISIS has been willing to has set up these kinds of bodies and has been willing to hear local complaints and actually does something about them, is why many locals in Syrian territories might feel that there's more of a sense of order to their lives now than when it was under when they were living under rebel control, under multiple factions, in a sense of, and there was really a lack of order. And a dawah office that I mentioned is very important in the early stages of ISIS's existence and their presence in various towns, outreach to locals, outreach to children, and so on. And also the implementation of Islamic law was less strict in Azaz, in the so-called Emirate of Azaz, than it is in IS territory now. For example, people will recognize how the niqab or abaya, the black garment covering basically a woman's whole body, is obligatory in Islamic State-held territories now. it wasn't obligatory in the Emirate of Azaz. ISIS would have a so-called dawah vehicle that would go around the streets of Azaz telling women, say, to wear a niqab, but it wasn't strictly obligatory. I mean, speaking of the more general atmosphere, as I'd mentioned, Azaz embodies the conservative Sunni Arab rural backbone of Syrian society, I feel. Azaz is conservative. All the women, at least, wear a hijab in Azaz. You don't see people without hijab. And a lot of women actually wear the niqab or the burqa. This is the so-called Committee to Address Injustices from the Sons of the Islamic State. So this is the committee ISIS would set up where you could take up a local complaint. If you had a problem with conduct of one of their members, you could take it up with this committee, and hopefully they would address it. This is a mural. I apologize for the poor quality of the photo. I took it while I was in Azaz, but I'm sorry it's not come out so great. But this is the familiar ISIS flag. No deity but God, and then the so-called seal of the Prophet, which says God, Messenger Muhammad. And this mural was painted outside a youth club that ISIS converted into one of their bases after they took over the town of Azaz. So this is October 2013. Another thing ISIS did is they made their murals ubiquitous in Azaz. Everywhere you go there, if you go there now, everywhere you'll go, you will see something. You will see something that is an ISIS mural in one way or another, or ISIS graffiti in some form. What they like to put up is Quran quotations. So the Almighty has said, cooperate on piety and fear of God, and don't cooperate on the basis of hostility and lack of piety. Once ISIS left Azaz, Northern Storm more or less decided to, Northern Storm returned to Azaz in this is the end of February of 2014. A bit more about that later. But once Northern Storm returned, they decided to leave these Quran quotation murals up because, it's a bit of an issue of sacrilegious behavior if you decide to start effacing Quran quotations. Other kinds of graffiti, just before I go on, is that I recall one of Taskut al-Thawra, which was put up by ISIS supporters in Azaz, which means down with the revolution, which really showed that ISIS's own agenda, which is quite distinct from any notion of a nationalistic revolution. Anyway, so going now into 2014, infighting between the rebels and ISIS breaks out at the beginning of the year. Northern Storm begins to regroup under a new leader, another local from Azaz called Mahmoud Nadoum. And what Northern Storm does to try to rebuild itself and to gain more credibility, I think, is to join the rebel coalition known as the Islamic Front that was established in November of 2013. And officially they are in the authority of this Liwat Tawheed that I'd mentioned earlier, because Liwat Tawheed originally was Syrian Islamic Liberation Front. November 2013 becomes part of the Islamic Front. And so Northern Storm officially subsumes itself under the authority of Liwat Tawheed and the Islamic Front. In the meantime, Ahmed Obeid, who I mentioned all the way back in 2012, he's elsewhere, and he's now formally part of Jabhat al-Nusra, Syria's al-Qaeda affiliate. Infighting breaks out across much of northern Syria. ISIS consolidates its territory around Raqqa, begins building contiguous territory around Raqqa in central northern Syria, and begins to seize control of towns in eastern Aleppo province and in southern Hasaka province, further out towards the east. The result of this is that by the end, and in the meantime, they withdraw from places like Idlib and Latakia. This is the key distinction between ISIS presence now, IS now, and ISIS back then, is that in the majority of places in northern Syria where ISIS had a presence, yes, you had the occasional stronghold like the Emirate of Azaz, but in the majority of places, ISIS was only one of a number of factions. And so much of the withdrawal that ISIS engaged in from territories in Idlib and Latakia was strategic, and the withdrawal from Azaz, which occurs at the end of February 2014, was also strategic. Basically, what happened is by the end of 2014. By the end of February 2014, Azaz is cut off from the rest of ISIS's territory, and so there's no longer any strategic value in holding it, and so ISIS withdraws, and Northern Storm, this marks the return of the Northern Storm Brigade. But Abu Ubaid al-Masri's Jaish Muhammad is still in Azaz. They remain there, and this is the next phase of tension that emerges in it. Abu Ubaid al-Masri's Jaish Muhammad is trying to push for stricter implementation of Islamic law. Eventually, August 2014, Islamic Front forces Jaish Muhammad to leave Azaz, and they do so. So this is, of course, one of the advantages of being part of a wide rebel coalition. That rebel coalition will use its clout on its behalf to maybe help you try to get your own way when you're in conflict with a group which, in contrast, is not part of any coalition and is independent. So August 2014, Jaish Muhammad leaves Azaz. Now, in theory, it should only be Northern Storm that's left, but actually what happens is the Jabhat, all along there's been there've been supporters of Jabhat al-Nusra inside of Azaz, but they haven't really had the numbers to have their own base inside the town, have a recognizable base inside the town, and that's actually what evolves from the aftermath of Jaish Muhammad's withdrawal from Azaz. And so by now, Jabhat al-Nusra has there's a street you go on in Azaz, and you will recognize the Jabhat al-Nusra base there. So it's a few dozen members in total in the town, but it's recognized. You feel the footprint. And also they control one of the mosques in Azaz, the Musab ibn Umair mosque. Just also December 2014, there's a Levant front. There's a new rebel coalition established, as I'd mentioned, the Levant Front. And Northern Storm joins that because it's part of the Islamic Front, and the Islamic Front in Aleppo joins this umbrella as well. This is the Musab ibn Umair mosque in Azaz. This is the one they mentioned. It's controlled by Jabhat al-Nusra. Northern Storm currently is a military force. So I said the heyday was in 2012, early 2013. That's not really the case now. They're really a shadow of their former selves. For example, they don't have influence over the Bab al-Salama border crossing anymore. If you go to Bab al-Salama border crossing on the Syrian side, it's part of the Levant Front coalition. It's not owned by the Northern Storm. It's not controlled by the Northern Storm as a local franchise anymore. 500 members, more or less now. This is the estimate most of them give. Mostly Sunni Arab. There are some people in the Northern Storm Brigade who claim to be of Kurdish descent. There is an Arabized Kurdish population in Azaz. By Arabized, I mean it speaks Arabic. It's completely assimilated into Sunni Arab society. I mentioned there are two fronts that Northern Storm fights on. One is against ISIS, or as it's of course now is just the Islamic State. I mentioned the town of Soran. That front line, as I mentioned, remains static for about since August 2014, and that's of course one of the points I think you missed if you don't go on the ground, is how low intensity much of this all is. When I went to the front line, nothing really going on there. They let me fire a gun towards IS positions. Of course, I didn't see any IS members in the distance. It was just wholly for show. So what happens on that front line then is therefore occasionally, a mortar round gets fired by one side or the other. Occasional gunshots. But no side advances, and this is so even as the coalition, the US-led coalition against IS, has occasionally launched airstrikes near this area targeting IS positions. So, for example, in Darbik, I actually, during my time there, the coalition launched an airstrike, and I remember Northern Storm members were quite happy about it. But otherwise, it's a stalemate. Assad regime I'd mentioned, the Handarat front, but Northern Storm isn't a vital force on that front. The bulk of the fighting gets done by Jabhat al-Nusra and jihadis on the Handarat front. And some people don't like Northern Storm, I mean, because they feel that they don't really do any fighting. They're just more concerned about making sure they have the monopoly of power in Azaz town. And so this idea of a media war, so to speak, that all the videos of Northern Storm guys going out to the front, it's all just for show. And because there was a rally of Northern Storm members on the 19th of December when I was there to go to Handarat, but apparently the Northern Storm members had returned the same day, so it was really just a brief visit for a few hours and come back. The way governance works in Azaz at the moment, there are two main bodies to note. There's a local council, the Majlis Mahalli, which is responsible for public services like electricity, sanitation, health, schools, water, distribution of aid for locals. But it's very limited services provision. Partly this has to do with the fact that, this is rebel-held territory. It's been out of regime control for a while. And so, the regime will cut off electricity. It becomes a blackout zone. And so people have to rely largely pretty much on private generators. The schools, here is an instance in which the regime has some leverage because it still pays teachers' salaries, and they have to go to Aleppo, to regime-held areas of Aleppo, to get those those salaries. And this actually draws criticism from Jabhat al-Nusra, because Jabhat al-Nusra feels that the education system in Azaz, as it's currently function, is too secularist. And so in the Musab ibn Umair mosque, which I'd mentioned is controlled by Jabhat al-Nusra, they've established an alternative place where parents can bring their kids for education. The council is in theory civilian, Medini, and independent, mustaqil, but in reality it becomes clear there are some ties between Northern Storm and the local council. So, for example, Samira Muri's son is on the local council. In theory also it's supposed to be a democratic body. They're hoping for elections in the summer of 2015. And the second major body to consider is the Sharia Committee, which also, again, is officially independent, but that's really formal distancing that's should be taken with a pinch of salt. Because actually, when I was there, and this is when Northern Storm, when the Islamic Front was still the coalition flag used there, rebel coalition flag used there, banner used there, you can see Islamic Front flags outside the Sharia Committee building. So really, it's the claims of independence and of being independent in a civilian body is largely farcical. Responsible for family law, public morality, and law and order. So they work with the local prison in Azaz as well. And Northern Storm functions essentially as the police force in Aleppo as well. In terms of the degree of Islamic law, how does it compare with, say, ISIS? They don't do any of these hudud punishments, the harsh punishments that are carried out for crimes like theft. So, for example, if someone is caught stealing, then the punishment is a jail sentence. It's not cutting off of the hand as ISIS does. And just to mention, as regards police force, Northern Storm acts as the police force. There have been some attempts to establish civilian bodies, like, for example, the Free Police of Aleppo, elsewhere in Aleppo province, but there's no evidence of this body actually existing inside of Azaz. And the Dar al-Qadha, I meant Dar al-Qadha means judiciary body. There have been some hopes by Northern Storm and the wider Levant Front coalition to establish a so-called Dar al-Qadha in the future to combine civil and religious matters, which is would be a key part of Levant Front administration. This hasn't actually. There's no explicit evidence for this yet, though. It's still largely talked. It's in words, but not in practice. Some activities of the local council. This is advertising of vaccinations. This is just a street in Azaz. This is outside the media center of Azaz. So this says Raqqa, and it has this knife and blood dripping out. It's meant to be in solidarity with Raqqa being under ISIS control. You may have heard of this being under IS control. You may have heard of this campaign, and it's in the wider media, called Raqqa is being slaughtered silently, and so that this this is in reflection of that. So the media center actually in Azaz, which publicizes some local news from Azaz, works with the local council as well. This was formerly a cafe, but it's no longer anything of the kind. If you compare with the likes of the Islamic State and Jabhat al-Nusra, well, the Islamic State is a much more sophisticated administration. It has much more specific bodies dealing with various aspects of public life, and does actually have more of a claim to be a state than I'd say that Northern Storm could ever claim, or the local council as could ever claim, with its various service departments, Diwan al-Khidmat, Diwan al-Ta'lim, this is for services, education, agriculture, a department for mosques and dawah work, for natural resources, for enforcing Islamic morality. These are IS departments. This is a massive evolution from the days of the Emirate of Azaz. It's a much more sophisticated administration now, and it's come about for a variety of reasons. Firstly, the fact that the Islamic State claims to be a caliphate now, and secondly, they've developed contiguous territory. They have much more of the trappings of a state. Jabhat al-Nusra doesn't yet have a declared state. They are aiming for an emirate in Syria, but they have some proto-state structures that have come about. For example, the Dar al-Qadha. So if the Levant Front is trying to create its own Dar al-Qadha, that indicates the competition with Nusra, because as I mentioned, Nusra is in many of these towns where Levant Front affiliates are officially ruling. And so if the Levant Front wants to establish a Dar al-Qadha, it's clear it's trying to make sure Nusra doesn't gain the upper hand as a more credible model of governance. Dar al-Qadha issues legal rulings, deals with public morality. As I mentioned, in some towns they are actually quite the Nusra Dar al-Qadha is quite influential, like Quraytan in further south in Aleppo province, which ordered computer game, billiard and table football stores to close, and shut down the Free Police of Aleppo stations on the ground that they were supposedly being supported by foreign powers. And so Jabhat al-Nusra established its own police stations affiliated to the Dar al-Qadha, with its Dar al-Qadha, that is. Which is an evolution in Nusra's strategy, because the prior Nusra strategy was to try to be more conciliatory towards other rebel groups and jointly participate with them in the running of Sharia committees. But Dar al-Qadha is designed to secure Nusra judicial monopolies and bring a sense of Jabhat al-Nusra state-like governance. And then there's a Maktab al-Dawah wal-Irshad for Jabhat al-Nusra, which issues fatwas, dawah activity, etc., etc. As in the wider trends, so this is concluding now, I feel Azaz embodies the wider story of how the Syrian civil war has developed over time. 2011, 2012, the nationalist moderate, or so-called moderate orientation of the rebellion, the emergence of these local brands that are in the heyday of their power, so Northern Storm and Azaz controlling the Bab influence and control over the Bab-Islam border crossing. 2013, the rise of ISIS, some of the conflicts that developed there. ISIS expelled Northern Storm from Azaz. There were other instances where similar instances in other towns, for example, in a further east in Aleppo called Jarablus, they expelled the local rebel group there, the family of Jadid. 2014, ISIS withdraws from many of its territories, withdraws from many areas where it has a presence, consolidates territory around Raqqa. Might be seen as a rebel victory, but in fact it's not. I mean, we saw how ISIS expanded rapidly in Syria over the summer of 2014, gaining control of most of Deir ez-Zor province, for example, precisely because they'd consolidated. They were no longer so thinly spread out. And secondly, though, in 2014, we now have the growing problem of Jabhat al-Nusra in the north, which is building its presence in places like Azaz, and as we know, also in other areas in northern Syria, had expelled other groups that might be seen as more moderate. So, for example, in Idlib, when they destroyed the Syrian Revolutionaries Front and Harakat Hizm. So that concludes the lecture.
quite sure you wouldn't hear such a detailed overview of the situation in a mid-sized Syrian town held by the rebels. I really enjoy that this was an anatomy of the Syrian revolution. Well, it's in its state right now, looking more like gangs fighting each other. But thank you for your excellent lecture.
Thank you. Are we doing questions or?
I think so. We'll.
Yeah. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
Can you estimate how many groups of rebels are in Syria? I mean, so many, dozens of groups.
No, I'd say one estimate that went around in early 2013, late 2012, put it around 1,000. Put it around 1,000 or over 1,000 rebel groups. One factor actually probably would have led to a reduction in that number is, for example, the fact that ISIS has taken over so many areas, and when they take over an area now, it precisely is subjugating all rival brands and forcing them to dissolve. So, for example, in Deir ez-Zor province, each town might have had several different rebel factions operating in it. But now, of course, it's just IS, and so those brands have completely disappeared. So to give an example of the reduction, the town of Al-Bukamal in eastern Syria on the border with Iraq had 6 factions in the town and even more in the surrounding periphery. But now it's just IS, so it's a big reduction. Now, I would say goes into probably hundreds of different rebel groups operating at this time. Of course, you know, one thing we have now is the era of coalitions, so to speak. So actually, this particularly applies to jihadi groups. Jaish Mohammed of Abu Ubaid al-Masri is quite the exception in remaining an independent Muhajirin battalion, so to speak. But most of the other jihadi groups have either formed their own coalitions, or they joined, say, Jabhat al-Nusra or ISIS.
Questions from here?
There's all these young men involved with quarreling and fighting and each other and whoever. Who takes care of the everyday life, agriculture, all kind of professions? I mean, how is normal life going on, if there is such a thing?
No, what I did notice in going to Azaz is that there is a sense of normal life going on, partly because it's not a frontline city. The last regime air raid, actually, when I went to Azaz, the last regime air raid that had occurred was about 3 months ago. So it's still far out of regime sites, but regime sites. But no, life is going on there. I went to the market, things function there as normal, people do business, and that was even true also when ISIS was in the town. I mean, life in the market continued as normal, for example. And I mentioned that you have the local council that's supposed to oversee public services, but I mentioned it's not a good provision. They don't really have they're not like ISIS. They don't have the funds to provide much of a meaningful sense of administration.
Aymenn, thanks. I'm curious about. Thank you. I'm curious about the idea of consolidation that IS when it comes to IS. To what extent, and this is a big question, probably varies quite a bit from one end of the country to the other, but to what extent is IS actually managing to consolidate its presence in the communities it controls in such a way that I mean, you showed a very detailed governance structure there, so suggesting that it's becoming to a degree self-sustaining, which from my perspective is a little bit more worrisome than a disforce just sort of sweeping through with no necessarily long-term prospect.
Right. That's exactly the point I would make, that the development of that structure ensures, it partly ensures they don't have local rivals to challenge them. There have been some agitations within IS territory, but it comes from people within IS. So, for example, Abu Talha al-Kuwaiti, who was again a Kuwaiti, not to be confused with Abdul Rahman al-Kuwaiti, but Abu Talha al-Kuwaiti, who was involved with the Diwan al-Hisba, which refers to enforcement of Islamic morality. In Raqqa, there was a supposed, there have been rumors of he's involved in some kind of coup attempt within Raqqa province. And also occasionally IS itself has advertised the so-called extinguishing of Khilai al-Ghulat, extremist cells. So, people talk about, if we get rid of IS, the son of IS will be an even more extreme version. Well, the fact that IS itself speaks about stamping out extremist cells speaks to the fact that, that there's some agitations that go on, but broadly speaking, these agitations don't fundamentally undermine IS control of its territories. So this is what I mean by consolidation, and this is one of the advantages to what IS's I think it made IS's move in the beginning of 2014 to consolidate territory around Raqqa and to make that territory contiguous where it was the only power in control. That was a very good move on their part in terms of consolidating their long-term prospects, because, as I say, the prior problem with their strategy that really forced them into these withdrawals in many cases, but as I say, also there's the element of strategy to it, is that being one of many factions in a town and being so widely spread out makes you quite vulnerable to being attacked on multiple fronts. So that's a big difference between 2013 and now.
Can you give us an example of the kinds of problems that would be dealt with in that organization of some kind, maybe?
Which one?
The organization that you spoke of that is supposed to address citizens' concerns. Can you give us
from the IS or from the
from IS?
No, the IS. Yes. Yes.
And how they would, what they would use, what the resolution would be.
Yes. So this committee that I'd mentioned from Azaz, it was meant to deal with local complaints. That again is a more primitive structure. What you would do now is you would go in an IS territory if you had a problem with the conduct of one of the rebels, with conduct of one of the members of IS, or it was causing you trouble, or you had a complaint about local residents, you'd take it up with the so-called Diwan al-Qadha wal-Madhalim, which means the Department of Judgments and Injustices. And so you bring the complaint. They'll bring the person in question via their Islamic police, Shurta al-Islamiyya. They'll bring him to the Diwan, or the Islamic court, and to explain himself, and then there'll be a judicial resolution of the case.
Do you have an example of something that was brought and how it was resolved?
Not specifically. Nothing immediately comes to mind.
Hi. You mentioned a lot of groups, a lot of organizations operating on the field. My question is, on what sort of things or parameters do you think these organizations agree on? Do they have something that guides them in general?
I think the main agreement, parameter of agreement and cooperation comes on the military front. So I mentioned Handarat, for example, that there've been multiple rebel groups working on it, although I feel that most fighting is done there by jihadist groups. But there is broadly cooperation. Also, if you go further south in Syria to Deraa on the border with Jordan, near Israel and Quneitra, the rebels broadly have an atmosphere of cooperation militarily. Jabhat al-Nusra and the so-called Southern Front. And so, but I think that's where it really ends, though. Jabhat al-Nusra has become notably more hardline in its approach. I mentioned the prior strategy was to work jointly with other rebel groups on Sharia committees, and the hope would be in the long run that they would gain monopolies over those committees, which they did achieve in some cases. So, for example, going back to Deir ez-Zor province in Al-Bukamal, Jabhat al-Nusra ended up controlling the Sharia committee, even though it was not the only faction in the town. And so that was greatly to greatly bolstered their authority. But now the approach of Jabhat al-Nusra is this Dar al-Qadha, which is designed to secure Jabhat al-Nusra monopolies on the control on judicial matters, and so that's really helping. That's helped build up tension in recent months, and actually over the past 8 or 9 months or so.
How secular was the population before all this started? Was the local population? And in what way does the level of secularization affect whatever regime is now? Do they take it into consideration or not?
I think one has to be careful, because I was not in Azaz before this all broke out, but I do feel that the conservative religious nature of the countryside tended to be overlooked, because people looked at the demonstrations in the cities and they thought, you know, this Syria is a country that's had an officially secular regime, therefore the uprising should be secular. But I think that's a bit mistaken. I'd mentioned, for example, the issue of women's dress, wearing a hijab. All the women, at least in Azaz, wear a hijab, or as many of them wear niqab or burqa. You could put some of that down to IS's influence and the influence of the civil war atmosphere. So I don't really think secular is the right word to use in this context. Although, as I say, there's a clear distinction between enforcement of Islamic morality in Azaz and IS. I mean, it's part of the same spectrum, but IS is much stricter. So I don't think secularism is quite the right word to think of here.
I have a lot of questions, but I'm
Uh-oh.
maybe one that we're talking about relevant to what you've been saying. Where do the Qadis come from? Like, is there like an organization that's training up?
No, exactly. That's a good question. That is a great question, because when I went to Friday prayers in one of the mosques, in the al-Maytam al-Islami mosque, I didn't show it in my slideshow of photos that I had, but I went to Friday prayers there, and the sermon was given by a man who was said to be the qadi of the was said to be a qadi on the Sharia committee. Again, the claim is that they're officially independent and civilian in nature. I don't know what his prior background was, but I say that kind of claim of civilian independent has to be taken with a bit of a pinch of salt, because I mean, it was quite clear also from the end notes he gave to his sermon that he was affiliated with the Islamic Front. So I'm sure the Islamic Front, you know, trains some of these people to become qadis. Actually, someone I did meet in the Sharia committee who isn't a qadi, who was an administration official. He previously worked in the Assad regime system of law, and he said, you know, we were a secular state, but now, of course, the move is towards an Islamic state.
You keep, Aymenn, you keep mentioning rebels. Whom do you consider to be the rebel, quote-unquote rebels?
Okay.
That's number one. Number two.
All right.
Can you try something like more sort of general? If you take the Islamic Front, which perhaps is what you mean by rebels, al-Nusra, and Daesh.
Right.
You look at all three, and all three are in Syria. Okay.
Right.
How would you define the differences today, as you see when you were there?
Okay, so for your first question, rebels, I'll use this for all the armed groups that are against the regime and aiming to overthrow it, except for Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS. And also arguably the other independent jihadi groups, because I think they could also be put in a category of their own. Second question is, what is the difference? That I mentioned, I do think there is a clear mark between the likes of the Islamic Front and IS. So, for example, smoking. If you smoking in IS territory will lead you to be taken to the Diwan al-Hisba, and you will probably get flogged. Now, incidentally, when ISIS controlled Azaz, the Emirate of Azaz, they didn't implement that punishment. Smoking was just rebuked by word, just don't do it. So it's, again, this is why I mentioned that the Emirates of ISIS weren't quite what we observe now in Islamic State territory, in the so-called caliphate. interestingly, I mean, I've been doing archives of Islamic State documents and Jabhat al-Nusra documents, and it's interesting to compare sometimes the rulings that come about. For example, IS put about a fatwa saying that it's acceptable to play billiards and table football, but it's not recommended because it might lead to harshness of the heart, and that's not good. Whereas Nusra, as I say, forced those stores that offer such games to be closed in Horaitan, in Aleppo province. And so what you could say is that, I mean, in that case, IS is being less strict than Nusra. But there's definitely more of a convergence going on now between Nusra and IS in terms of the model of governance. It becomes increasingly alike.
You mean Nusra are moving towards IS?
Yes, yes. And part of the reason for the development of these bodies like Dar al-Qadha, which are more hardline in the approach of governance via the other rebel factions, is that it's definitely a way to compete with IS, because IS, one of the appeals of IS, I think, in the wider jihadist debate on the validity of this so-called caliphate is the fact that in many ways it has the appearance, it has structures of a real state. I mean, some of the documents I've collected: phone subscriptions, parking tickets, university exam timetables in Mosul, medical college set up in Raqqa. In Syria in particular, it's really becoming quite comprehensive, and that's partly why IS doesn't have local rivals who can challenge it. And this is one of the things I would warn about the strategy of trying to train a rebel force to take on IS. The question is, if they can't offer an alternative model of governance to what IS has implemented, then there's a good probability they will face a lot of resistance from the local population. They'll just be seen as mercenaries of the United States.
There.
A simple question. Could you tell us, please, about the size of the population that ISIS controls in Syria and in Iraq?
I tend not to like to throw numbers around arbitrarily, but I would put it in the several million at the minimum. There are some areas of the several million. Six, maybe at least say six, at least 6 or 7 million. Part of the problem is that two things to consider about IS territory is that a lot of it actually is quite sparsely populated. So, for example, Hasaka province in eastern Syria, which IS has named Wilayat al-Barakah, it's villages mostly. There aren't really any major towns that they control there that are, say, comparable to the likes of Mosul, Fallujah in Iraq. Mosul is, I think, the biggest city they control, and followed by Raqqa. Some areas of IS control have become virtually depopulated, like the city center of Tikrit. Not the wider area of Tikrit, but the city center has become, since it fell under IS control, became largely depopulated. So that has to be borne in mind.
How about the Jabhat al-Nusra?
Yeah, that's even more difficult to work out. The way Jabhat al-Nusra is developed in terms of its control is it has large numbers of strongholds, exclusive strongholds in Idlib province. In Aleppo province, it hasn't quite built that up yet, but it's trying to go that way. And I'd mentioned, so this is the context of some of the tensions in towns like Azaz and the emergence of these Dar al-Qadha. Maybe, you know, in the several 100,000 probably living under exclusive Nusra control. Rastan, actually, in Homs province, once quite a well-known center of the rebellion, has become a Nusra stronghold. Okay.
Over there?
Yes.
Thank you. I wanted to know what the attitudes were in Azaz and other areas you've been towards the YPG and the other Kurdish groups.
Yes, YPG. So the YPG dynamic, which I really didn't discuss in the lecture. One of the reasons many of the rebel groups didn't want to fight ISIS back in 2013 as well was partly because ISIS were in an active war against the YPG, and many of the rebel groups actually ended up cooperating with ISIS against the YPG. So, for example, in Tel Abyad in Raqqa province, the expulsion of the Kurdish militia presence was because of cooperation between ISIS and the rebels in that town back in August of 2013. As for the current attitudes, there's more or less a ceasefire now. The rebel groups don't attack Afrin. It's official neutrality, but they don't trust the YPG though. Many of them see it as pro-regime. They accuse it, say, of sending reinforcements to Assad regime forces in Nubal and Zahra, for example. So I would say, it's de facto neutrality, but it's a good deal of suspicion. And if we look at the tensions that have come about in post-2003 Iraq between the Kurdistan regional government and Baghdad, I'll think what it might be like, say, in the context of a post-Assad order, between a rebel, between a post-Assad administration with strong rebel militia influence and the YPG.
Can you follow up and ask if there's any sense of or any discussion about the female fighters of the YPG?
No one discussed that in Azaz. Certainly no female fighters for Northern Storm.
Rachel?
I have a question about the very act of implications of the act of declaring the caliphate. Aside from in the short term, I think we've seen stepping up of administration and the structures of the state. And this obviously calls for a lot of speculation on your part, but due to your familiarity with these groups, I thought maybe you could throw something out there. In the long term, let's say the Islamic State project, as we know it now, dwindles, and do you see the proliferation of establishments of caliphates? Do you see this another group coming in?
Well, I mentioned the Ghulat cells, that the extremist cells that.
Seem like more propaganda on this side of the Islamic State.
No, but the question of a son of IS establishing its own rival caliphate is not something to be dismissed completely out of hand. Some people thought Boko Haram might be trying to set up its own rival caliphate, but what they've done is, and it was pretty predictable actually, they joined IS. It's possible.
The floodgates have been opened.
Maybe.
You didn't mention the regime. Is the regime just standing back and allowing all this to happen?
Where you mean in terms of the in Azaz? Well, they can't get to Azaz via ground forces yet, which speaks to the severe limitations of their. They only conduct air raids occasionally, as I mentioned. That the last one, when I went, it had taken place 3 months before that, and it was pretty minor actually. It damaged a couple of buildings here and there, but it wasn't a flattening of Azaz or anything like that.
Aymenn, currency.
Yes. Oh, you mean currency in Azaz?
Yes.
Okay, they use the Syrian pound. I was able to exchange some Turkish liras in the market for some Syrian pounds because my friend wanted to buy something. So I helped him out in that regard.
Have you seen any of ISIS?
No, I haven't seen ISIS currency.
No gold.
No.
We only saw it on the internet.
No.
And that's where it is right now. Probably it's like the Bitcoin.
On the internet and on posters and
Islamic Bitcoin.
well, the ISIS, when they put out a statement by their Diwan al-Am, the public security, offering rewards for anyone who could kill a Jordanian pilot, they said you could get it in dinars, but if the person wants, he can get it in the currency of his choice. Okay.
Can I have a question?
All right, go on. Yeah.
One last.
Yeah, this is the last question now. Yes.
Speaking about the Raqqa.
Yes.
How much of a state did Raqqa know long before 2011?
Bit of a difficult question for me to answer because I didn't go there before 2011. But yeah, the problem is that, and this is a general problem in going there, is that if you ask people about what life was like before, it's going to be tainted by the perceptions of, through the lens of what's happened now. So when I went to Azaz, people told me that they said, oh well, the regime neglected this area because it's Sunni. They talked about discrimination in favor of Alawites and so on, and they talked about more general neglect of the rural countryside, which I think there's some validity to all of that, but would they have said the same thing in private in a conversation before 2011 is a bit more uncertain. So I can't really, I'm afraid I can't really give it...
normal electricity.
Okay, yes. Now, okay, that I can answer. That I can answer. Yes. Yes. Yes, that I can answer specifically on electricity in Raqqa is that one of the ways that IS is more of a state in Syria than in Iraq is that in Syria they can provide electricity as a public service because they control dams along the Euphrates. So that leads to public provision of electricity. It varies between 4 and 8 hours a day, but by the admission of someone who of a pro-IS activist I spoke to on a Facebook chat, he said that electricity provision was better during the days of the regime. He didn't say specifically how many hours it was, but he said yes, it was better, and presumably that has to do with more competence on the part of the regime to manage electricity supplies.
That was in Iraq.
Better under the regime than under IS now in Raqqa. But Mosul, in contrast, doesn't have that kind. IS doesn't have the ability to provide electricity as a public service. It does it via all private generators.
So in Raqqa, it's between 4 and 8 hours a day.
Between 4 to 8 hours a day, yeah.
And in Azaz?
Azaz, it's private generators. So private generators, yes.